I'm gonna hit you up with a fun fact that everyone who's ever been 10 years old knows with the utmost of certainty. Battleships are cool. Some nerd might come along and say, but aircraft carriers are the true way to achieve naval supremacy, and I think that kind of person is a loser. I don't care about achieving aerial supremacy 5,000 miles from the coastline. I want a big boat with a bunch of big guns firing shells the size of a car at people. It may be stupid, and it may have been one of the ways the old guard of admirals in the 1900s failed to understand new ways of warfare, but I don't care. Battleships are cool, and that's all that matters. And quite clearly, plenty of people agree with me, because Warhammer 40k has the might of the Imperial Navy. We may be 40,000 years into the future, but there's nothing like building a massive hunk of steel, putting thousands of guns on it, and firing broadsides at other spaceships like it's the golden age of piracy. Like everything in 40k, it takes a goofy concept and ratchets things up to 11. In this case, by making the ship the size of a small city, giving it guns that might as well fire houses at people, and nailing a cathedral to everything that didn't already have a gun in place. And then putting guns on the cathedral, because subtlety is for losers who don't think battleships are cool. And that's the gist of today's video. You may look at certain characters and go, how emotionally compelling, or certain story arcs in the setting and think of how interesting they are in all sorts of ways. All that nerd crap can go sit in the corner for now, because today I want to talk about big battleships blowing things up in space. But since we're going to be talking about the Imperial Navy, I thought I should mention something that those crewmen probably don't get in 40k. Good sleep. I can't imagine that some gunnery officer from Battlefleet Gothic is getting much in the way of quality mattresses. But unlike those poor fellas in the 41st millennium, you can be getting just that with Helix Sleep, the sponsor of this video. Helix Sleep offers the finest mattresses on the planet to make sure you rest your best. I've had my premium Helix mattress for about 2 months now, and to cut to the chase, it's great. I've got the Helix Midnight Luxe, and it's probably the most comfortable thing I've ever slept on. It's exactly as firm as I like. I've slept wonderfully on this thing. In all honesty, before I had been using it for a good while, I wasn't sure how much better it would be than my old mattress. My doubts were very quickly put to rest themselves. This mattress is phenomenal. Athena loves it too, even if I wish she would stop laying down exactly where I sleep when I go to bed. All this room, and she chooses to lay down in my spot. And with the Helix Sleep Quiz you take to get the perfect mattress for you, you'll end up with just what you need as well. There's 20 unique mattresses available, such as the award-winning Luxe and Premium collections, the Helix Plus for those who need a bit more room in bed, and the Helix Kid mattress, because kids deserve a good night's rest too. And if you're like me and paralyzed with indecision at the thought of all these different options, there's no need to worry. Aside from the sleep quiz matching you with the perfect mattress, these things are custom fitted and delivered right to your door. So there's not only no need to go around a mattress store constantly second guessing your every decision, but you don't even need to leave the comfort of your own home to get yourself a premium mattress. After that, all you do is unroll it and it sets itself right up. And Helix is so confident that you'll love the mattress that it not only comes with a 100-day sleep trial period to ensure you love it, but a 10-year warranty to boot with flexible financing options and payment plans. Getting your best night's sleep doesn't have to be expensive. Click the link in my description or go to helixsleep.com/PancreasNoWork to get 20% off your mattress plus 2 free pillows. That's helixsleep.com/PancreasNoWork for 20% off the ultimate mattress and 2 pillows to deck it out with. Sleep is the most important time of the day, so why not use Helix Sleep to make it as comfortable as possible? Now then, turn down your IQ a couple dozen points and let's talk about big exploding spaceships. The Imperial Navy, or Navis Imperialis if you're a pretentious twat, is of course the spaceborne arm of the Imperium of Man's military. But way back in the days of the Great Crusade, it and the Guard were one combined force, simply called the Imperial Army. Every ship had a detachment of land troopers along with it, and it worked quite nicely all things considered. Then Horus did his little goof and started heresying all over the place, and Rabute Gilliman decided that this combined land and naval force needed the same treatment as the Space Marines did when it comes to one single person potentially commanding millions of people. And while it can lead to problems, I will once again defend this decision, because imagine if you will for a moment a guardsman general or a Navy admiral of the Imperium turning traitor. The general will find they don't have a ship to go anywhere with, and the admiral won't actually be able to hold territory because they don't have an army. By contrast, the combined Imperial Army commanders would have both a land force as well as a space force to go conquer whatever they wanted with. And even ignoring heresy directly related to Horus, some traitorous commanders did just that. Some awfully ambitious folk just went around claiming systems for themselves in the midst of the heresy, because both Horus and the Emperor were a bit preoccupied and couldn't really spend time wrangling random commanders who wanted to do their own empire building. So they split it into the Guard and Navy, and now no one can instantly get a sector-conquering force if they decide the Imperium just isn't for them. There were also, or may still be, massive fleets known as anchorage war fleets. They were positioned around massive orbital complexes that were only smaller in scale than what the likes of Mars itself had, and were intended to act as a reserve force as well as take on patrol duty. They were founded around the time the Great Crusade had succeeded in conquering a pretty substantial majority of the galaxy, and so plans were made going forward with the idea of holding territory in mind rather than taking it. One was ultimately created in each segmentum, and more were planned to be built later. I said there were also these fleets, and more were planned because, my knowledge, this was a pre-heresy thing. Empire-shattering civil wars tend to put a stop to big projects like this. Now, the history of the Imperial Navy is honestly exactly what you would expect the history of the Imperium of Man's Navy to be. They go around blowing stuff up. So, if you really want a retelling of events the Navy is involved in, go watch a Let's Play, or just go play Battlefleet Gothic. This video, to just tell you the full truth, is more about how it's organized and the kinds of ships in it. This is because I want to talk about big ships with big guns, just in case you missed it the first few times I said something along those lines. What I will say for its history is that as time went on, the Imperial Navy eventually got a reputation for being a slightly holy institution in and of itself. On the ecclesiarchy side of things, they preached that it was the arm of the Emperor himself, and given how navigators are soulbound to the Emperor, there may be some truth to this. The massive cathedrals they put on top of these things probably help in this regard as well. On the Mechanicus side of things, battleships are absolutely the sort of thing they'd worship as an avatar of the Omnissiah, so they doubtlessly consider any sort of ship advanced enough to be holy. Given that this is the Imperial Navy and they're only going to be using incredibly powerful weapons, the Mechanicus certainly views these ships with some level of reverence. Now, as for how the Navy works, buckle up because there's a whole load of naval lore about to get dropped on you like an anchor. Was that joke too forced? It felt forced. Whatever. We'll go top down through the ranks. Starting off, we have the Lord High Admiral of the Imperial Navy. This is the guy who represents the Navy's interest to the High Lords of Terra, and is occasionally a High Lord themselves. If the Navy needs more funding, and given that this is 40k, the Navy always needs more funding, this is the dude to bother the High Lords until they give it to him. For your own readiness, there are 6 kinds of Admiral under this guy, all of whom do the actual fleet commanding, as this seems to be a political position. The first position down that potentially does actual naval stuff is the Lord High Admiral. Yes, I'm aware both of those positions have Lord High Admiral in the name. I didn't make the lore. There's only 5 of these lads, and they each command the Imperium's Navy over an entire segmentum. One of them is usually chosen to become the next representative of the Navy on Terra, and while given their purview they probably don't command many battles directly, they're doubtlessly as competent as an admiral can get. The doctrines and plans of an entire segmentum are at their whims, so they'd best know what they're doing. Going further down the line, a Lord Admiral commands an entire sector's worth of ships, and a Solar Admiral is essentially a Lord Admiral who's just waiting for the position to open up. If no current Lord Admiral has recently either retired or exploded, they're generally either going to be put in charge of a reserve fleet used to reinforce sector fleets or given their own special duties. The second to last of the admirals is a Vice Admiral who's in charge of part of a fleet, generally destroyers and frigates as part of their vanguard. And the last is the Rear Admiral, which in the modern Imperial Navy is the logistics guy. For a given meaning of the word, this probably makes them the smartest person in a given fleet, because this dude has to figure out how the hell the supply chain sustains itself after half the ships randomly disappear into the warp during routine travel. Yeah, I bet you never thought about that, did you? Sure, it sucks for the people on a ship when it vanishes into the warp, but you probably never even considered what that means for the rest of the fleet and its supply chain. Be thankful for the Rear Admirals of the Imperium of Man, because they're the ones who have to figure out how to keep going when that kind of nonsense happens. Man, there's a whole lot of ranks still to go. I'm getting flashbacks to the Inquisition. I've also not a single idea as to whether or not these are real-life naval ranks. They sound incredibly British, so I'm going to choose to believe that they are what the Royal Navy actually uses without actually checking it. Or indeed checking if they're still called the Royal Navy. Anyways, finally getting away from all the admirals, we have Commodores. These are really just captains in charge of a squadron of ships and maybe something of an advisor to a given admiral position. Lord Captains and Captains are the same thing, with Lord Captain really just being an honorific title. Commanders are in charge of escort-class ships, lieutenants are in charge of individual ship systems, and midshipsmen are officers in training. Below them are warrant officers, who keep the ship running on a day-to-day level. You've got shipmasters, who tragically are not badass elite commanders, but instead are in charge of things like overseeing supplies and the starship's log. A gunmaster is the chief of a gunnery crew, a sergeant-at-arms is in charge of a squad of armsmen in case the ship is either boarding another or is boarded itself, and the bosun is the guy in charge of whipping the average crew members and slaves on board the ship to keep them productive. Slaves most often, I imagine, because some Imperial starships are so old and vast, generations of slaves are born and die on them without even knowing they're on a starship. They'll form tribes, and sometimes the rest of the people working on them have to put down uprisings. And the list of ranks continues on, but the list of ranks I care about is pretty much finished. This is because there's another 1,000 of them, and I don't care enough to talk about them. I will mention before we move on, however, that much like the Guard, the Navy has commissars as well. They perform much the same role here, only this time the people they watch have the firepower to level a planet if they go rogue. They'll usually spend time jumping between the ships of a fleet, going around making sure everyone is ready to suck vacuum for the Emperor if need be. You know, all that good commissar stuff. The ships of the Imperial Navy, meanwhile, are that wonderful blend of awe-inspiring faith, power, and the inability to actually maintain and recreate half of what it owns that makes the Imperium so fun. Much like how they play in Battlefleet Gothic, Imperial ships are somewhat slow and cumbersome things. The flip side is that when they do finally lumber into broadside range, they're going to unleash hell on the enemy. This is assuming they don't just ram straight through your ship, because on the list of things that survived from our time to the 41st millennium, cocaine is apparently one of them. It works as often as not, and if you get enough Imperial ships together, you can use them as a makeshift tugboat fleet. Or have them push something, like Abaddon using a bunch of ships to shove the Blackstone Fortress into Cadia. Yeah, that's technically the Chaos Fleet, but they just use older Imperial vessels, so same difference. There's 3 rough ship categories you can form in the Imperial Navy: battleships, cruisers, and escort ships. There's also plenty of fighters and bombers that can be deployed as well, though 40k being what it is, the big ships are the ones actually putting the work in most of the time. Going in reverse order, escort ships consist of frigates and destroyers. Destroyers work wonders at maneuvering around the enemy fleet to harass them, while frigates are more heavily armed by comparison. They usually work together in groups of 2 to 6, and both of them, in addition to being escorts, have the venerable duty of eating torpedoes with their face so a capital ship doesn't have to. Turns out you still can have meat shields even with spaceships. Cruisers, meanwhile, make up the majority of any given Imperial fleet. Faster than battleships, but far more heavily armed than escorts, these are the workhorses of the Navy. They strike me as a sort of holdover when brute force generalization was the Imperium's thing, rather than turning the Primaris into aspect warriors. Yes, I will complain about that every conceivable chance I get. There's light and heavy cruisers that can be armed with all sorts of different weaponry, but the role is much the same throughout. There's also grand cruisers, which is just a cruiser but real big, to the point that half the time the fleet they're in just classifies them as a battleship. Speaking of, we of course have the battleships. The big guns never tire in the Guard, and that's just as true in the Navy. A good deal of the types of battleship were built in a time when people still knew how to make cool things, and as a result, a lot of the ones destroyed just can't be replaced. Amongst the battleships, there are 3 types most commonly used. There's the Emperor class, designed more as a carrier for massive amounts of fighters and bombers, the Victory class, for all sorts of lance weaponry, and the Retribution class, known for being the most standard of the battleship classes. By which I mean it charges into broadside range, someone presses the funny button, and then your ship vanishes as 1,000 cannons the size of a house open fire. There are numerous other battleship types, but special mention to the Gloriana class battleship. These bad boys were used as flagships of the Space Marine Legions before Guilliman decided that Space Marines shouldn't be allowed to use those kinds of toys anymore, and were just the most disgusting monsters the Imperium could throw at you in space. 12.5 miles long, packed with more guns than you could even figure out what to do with, and oftentimes with a Primarch at the helm, these things would obliterate anyone stupid enough to get in their way. Guilliman uses one as a flagship in modern times, the Macragge's Honor, because he made the rules, so if he wants to break them, that is entirely fair and reasonable. Also, he's a Primarch, not a Space Marine, so it's not technically breaking the rules anyways. At this point, I would like to add that my hatred of carriers is very much an in-universe thing. The Garek's prerogative was a group of tacticians that were in favor of carriers over more standard battleships. A civil war eventually broke out between the 2 groups, and it was battleships armed to the teeth that won the day, rather than carrier battleships. Those in favor of carriers liked them because they saw how effective trader forces were at using them, and indeed, most of them joined the traders once the Civil War was wrapped up. So because of that little black mark, the Imperium and its navy as a whole is a bit iffy on the concept of carriers. Actual aircraft carriers are awesome, it's just fun to make fun of them in 40k, and it's lore friendly. Somewhat relatedly, if you've any interest in World War II naval history and haven't watched it, watch the documentary series Battle 360. It's about the aircraft carrier the USS Enterprise and its tour in the Pacific Theater. I watched it so much as a kid that the words "a fighting city of steel" are burned into my frontal cortex. Aircraft carriers are fucking cool, I'm just not here for them in 40k is all. Ignoring the type of ship whose builders were indecisive and just jammed whatever weapons they had to hand on them into it, there's also 3 ways a ship is outfitted with weapons. Carriers are, of course, carriers, and therefore are boring and we shouldn't talk about them for long. They hold fighters and bombers, that's it. Ordnance ships, meanwhile, carry heavy ordnance. I am in fact literate, I know what words mean. In all actuality, though, these are the ships that go all in on the broadside thing. Strap 50 cannons to the side of the thing, and then strap another 50 on top for good measure. It's all about the big guns with these ones. Although alternatively, these weapons are used not necessarily because they're the most effective or the ones the captains want, but to save power so the ship can mount something like a Nova cannon. Pro tip, do not get hit by a Nova cannon. They are a phenomenal way of unmaking whatever you point them at. And finally, we have lance ships. These ships have high-powered beams of energy for their main weapons. They fire fast, deal a lot of damage, but as a trade-off, they do dick all to void shields. A single lance ship is honestly not much of a threat to anything even remotely equivalent to it. Then you get 6 destroyers all with lance cannons working in tandem with an ordnance ship, and suddenly they're the deadliest things in the galaxy. If you find yourself commanding a lance ship, do your best to make friends. The lone wolf lancer will find himself dead sooner rather than later, but working together means even the mightiest of chaos battleships doesn't have much of a chance. Now you might be wondering, how does the Imperium use its navy? I mean, aside from beating people over the head with it, of course. Well, have you ever heard the phrase, "He who defends everything defends nothing"? The Imperium thinks whoever said that is a massive bitch, because if you let even a single planet fall without sacrificing billions for it, you're clearly a heretic and deserve death. Or Cryptman, for all the difference that makes. As a result, the Navy's most common job is patrolling Imperial space to make sure there's no bad things afoot. To give it some amount of credit, most of what they end up fighting on the day-to-day basis are pirates or the occasional rebellious world that somehow got its hand on spaceborne assets. A single Imperial cruiser is almost certainly a match for your average pirate, and honestly, a couple of frigates and destroyers could probably take on most of them as well. While piracy is still a massive problem for the Imperium, it covers the entire galaxy. There's gonna be problems. Pound for pound, the Imperial Navy is actually incredibly good at policing its trade lanes and keeping domestic threats in line. The problem comes whenever one of the bigger threats rears their ugly head. You might have wondered at some point, as I have, why the Imperium doesn't just throw more ships at problems as they occur. Among a myriad of other reasons, the chief one is because with so much territory to cover, sometimes the Imperium doesn't have ships in active reserve available. Everyone's either out patrolling or far too distant to make it in time. So when an Orc war boss gets enough boys in space under his command, or a Tyranid hive fleet shows up, they can take sector after sector after sector before enough naval force is gathered to stop it. It's almost funny because the Imperial Navy is generally one of the few organizations within the Imperium that's just competent. Sure, sometimes the occasional nepo baby will pop up, like a rogue trader's kid who's just there to learn for later, but for the most part it's an actual well-run organization within the Imperium. But because Imperial doctrine demands everything must be protected, for all is mankind's sacred realm, being spread thin doesn't even begin to describe the Navy. Ships will be spread across the entire Imperium, without the ability to properly react to massive threats before they bite chunks out of the entire galaxy. It's a problem you face in grand strategy games like Stellaris, or even Total War around the mid and end game. You've got a whole lot of land and a whole lot of production, but you've also got a whole lot of enemies and fronts to take care of at the same time. Maybe you'll luck out and your main enemies are along an area with most of your forces deployed, or maybe you'll have 50 different threats on all sides declaring war, and there's only so much military to go around. That's the biggest problem with the Imperial Navy. Further complicating matters is the Great Rift. You want to do your job in half the galaxy? Good luck, asshole, because there's a giant gaping hole cutting across it. Roughly half the Imperial Navy now has to contend with the fact that they cannot actually see where they're going once warp travel starts. And warp travel is an iffy thing to begin with at the best of times, given that there's a non-zero chance of your ship time traveling, or being possessed Event Horizon style, or even just arriving late after everyone else does. That one's honestly the most crucial failing of warp travel, and purely for logistical reasons. It's a lot harder to wage war when strategic deadlines are more suggestions than fact. That's not to say the Navy doesn't have any sort of dedicated defense fleets, or rather, had in most instances. The Bastion fleets were the ones that guarded the Eye of Terror. Even as determined to defend every inch as the Imperium is, they know damn well there's some threats you need a whole lot of guns pointed at all times. Given how Imperial fleets are named, you could probably guess what most of them were called beforehand. Battlefleet Cadia, for example, was specifically in charge of defending the Cadian sector. Same for Battlefleet Gothic and the Gothic sector, although sometimes, as in the case of Battlefleet Solar, they're just named after an entire segmentum. Given Segmentum Solar contains Terra, Mars, and is overall rather important, it makes sense to have one colossal fleet there to keep out any stray Hive fleets or Black Crusades. Imperial battle fleets can contain a vastly varied amount of ships, though 50 is generally the baseline minimum for one. Of course, depending on circumstances, this number can be far higher. The Bastion fleets, while oftentimes using substandard ships because of a need for more bodies to throw at Black Crusades, were appropriately huge. Half of them weren't yet fitted with most of their weapons, and the other half might have been breaking down from battles of the last Black Crusade, but by God, there would be thousands of them. And given that Battlefleet Solar is in charge of defending not only an entire segmentum, but the segmentum that contains the Emperor's rotting corpse, I would assume it has enough ships in it to blot out the sun if it was gathered over a single planet. And as much as I was making fun of the Imperium for lacking proper reserve forces for its navy, they do exist. The position of Solar Admiral exists, I talked about it. It's just that, as you can probably guess, the Imperium being so huge and warp travel as unreliable as it is means even the largest of reserves can only do so much to respond to proper threats. Many sectors and subsectors are in fact based around how much space a fleet can theoretically patrol in a time frame, and as a result, there's vast swaths of space between sectors that are under Imperial control but have minimal naval presence. Standard patrols of ships might be as small as an actual match of Battlefleet Gothic, with only half a dozen ships at most patrolling light years worth of space. And given how degraded the Navy is, battleships themselves are in rare supply, further hindering their ability to respond to major threats in a timely manner. This is granted one of those narrative things where GW says there's barely any battleships left and then everyone has 3 of them in their back pocket, but for patrol duty at least, they're rarely deployed because they just don't exist. For what it's worth though, when reserves are well placed and the Imperial Navy has all its bases covered when it comes to ship types and fleet composition, there's damn few things in the galaxy that can stop it short of complete and utterly overwhelming force. During High Fleet Behemoth's incursion into the galaxy, it was the Imperial fleet in space that ultimately won the day after the Ultramarines barely avoided being eaten alive. True, they were commanded by Calgar, but that's rather less spectacular than other cases of Space Marines winning the day because it's actually quite difficult to punch a hive ship to death. They had his brain, sure, but it was also the brawn of the battleships that helped. Incidentally, using battleships you can't build more of as suicide bombers might not be a fantastic long-term use of resources, but it's a phenomenal short-term method of making whatever is bothering you go away forever. During the Damocles Gulf Crusade, the Tau in one of the first space battles were picking apart Imperial ships with their superior ranged weaponry. Then one mad bastard flew in between the Tau fleet and opened up with its broadsides, and they learned as they did with Titans that things like logical tactics and not building obscene superweapons do not do terribly well in 40k. Indeed, were it not for the Hive fleets invading, the combined efforts of the Navy and the Guard were likely to sweep their way through the Tau Empire. And of course, even though it was ultimately what doomed Cadia, the Imperial Navy, in conjunction with not only Space Marine forces but the Phalanx itself, had gutted Abaddon's Blackstone Fortress. Just to really hammer that home, the Imperial Navy did not let the Blackstone Fortress crash into Cadia because they forgot about it. It crashed into Cadia because for all intents and purposes, the Navy had turned it into a piece of scrap metal, and they made the assumption that Abaddon wasn't stupid or desperate enough to burn a small fleet's worth of ships to crash it into the planet. Helping this is that the Imperial Navy in many ways is a jack-of-all-trades sort of faction. They may not be the fastest, that would be the Eldar. They may not have the toughest ships, that would be the Necrons. They may not have the most overall damaging weaponry, that would be the Tau or again the Eldar. But they have good enough in every category that when combined with the Imperium's absurd level of additional ships to throw at a problem and an admiral who knows what they're doing, there's nothing quite like it when the Navy goes to war. Building your ships to act as battering rams also helps, because Newton's third law is a son of a bitch. But to once again hammer another point home, all of this is frequently worthless in the types of war the Imperium finds itself in. Go back to them being so spread out. By the time the Imperium has finally marshaled its navy, the first few dozen planets have been conquered, or eaten, or kidnapped if the Dark Eldar are feeling particularly ambitious today. And sometimes even when things go as well as possible, the navy still can't be used to its fullest extent for a variety of other reasons. Even ignoring Abaddon's fleet, the navy can't just bombard Cadia from orbit when traitors and demons start landing because it's Cadia. You really don't want to just start bombarding your chief fortress planet keeping the scary monsters at bay. Additionally, losing the navy means you've lost the war for a given planet. Sure, losing the guard army you deployed sucks, but if the navy's still in orbit, you can ferry in more troops. If you lose the fleet, then now you can't ferry more guard ships in because there's no navy to do it with or protect those ships for the time being. They're also just incredibly expensive to build and maintain, assuming they can even rebuild a certain ship class, so losing a battleship is the sort of thing that can bankrupt multiple planets. The Imperium, unlike the countless lives they throw away on the ground, is very much hesitant to do the same with even the lighter navy ships. While it may mean you're going to have to deal with cleaning up the spores, in many cases it's honestly far more worth it to deal with the orcs on the ground. Otherwise you risk losing one of the most intricate and devastating pieces of technology mankind has ever built to a skyscraper-sized piece of junk some mech boy strapped 50 rocket engines on and sent it on a collision course. And even beyond all that, there's a lot of enemies the Navy just can't deal with. You can't bombard a cult from orbit without wasting countless resources, and by the time you can, the world is doomed anyways. Or forces like the Eldar, who are the most annoying things for a Navy commander to fight. The craft-world Eldar are only ever going to fight in the most decisive and advantageous of circumstances. Suddenly an entire Eldar fleet will pour out of the webway, decimate the naval force present, and then dip back out. If they don't do that, it's because they're a commander of the likes of Prince Uriel, who has so many ships and victories to his name, he probably commands a segmentum's worth of ships all to himself anyways. Or the Dark Eldar, who when they aren't disguising themselves as regular Eldar or cargo haulers, aren't picking fights with the Navy itself. Instead, they wait for the Navy to leave, kidnap everyone at the port they were holed up in, and then throw a neutron star at the fleet when it returns for shits and giggles. For all its power, there's some threats the Navy just can't feasibly take on. And while the Navy itself may run a tight ship, haha boat joke, it doesn't always have the best relations with other organizations. Now, if you look into the history of weapons development at any level, or are familiar with how branches of the military view each other, this is of no surprise to you. The Navy and the Guard have a habit of getting into pissing matches every now and then. Pissing matches that are usually vastly in the Navy's favor. A lot of times, the end result is the Navy not allowing fighters and bombers to support the Guard on the ground, because the Aeronautica Imperialis is a branch of the Navy. If the admiral or a captain in charge of a given battle decides you don't get any more than the occasional Valkyrie to help you out, then sucks to suck, Guardsmen, you should have thought about having your general not piss off the guy in charge of the fighter jets. There's also the matter of Space Marines. Now, the Space Marines as a whole are usually looked at with as much reverence by the average Navy member as anyone else in the Imperium. Those are the Emperor's angels, you damn well better show them respect. But part of Guilliman's splitting up of the armed forces also involved not letting Space Marines lug around too many battleships. This isn't strictly speaking something they all go along with. God knows the Ultramarines themselves have quite the fleet, even if technically it's Ultramar's fleet and not theirs. And the Space Wolves pulled an entire battle fleet out of their asshole during the months of shame. It's just that, on average, Astartes fleets are designed to assist them with boarding actions and getting troops on the ground. This is, to some degree, another way to limit their power after the heresy, but it also just kinda makes sense. A Space Marine and a normal person can push the button labeled fire all guns equally well, so there's no reason to waste both naval assets and Space Marine assets by crewing them with super soldiers. This is, again, not really much in the way of rivalry or dislike, but if you ever wondered why Space Marine ships all love to ram and board, it's very much intentionally so. For what it's worth, though, and the ultimate thing I think it has going for it, is that the Imperial Navy works incredibly well in spite of all the things it has going against it. When the ball gets rolling, nothing short of the Great Rift can actually stop it. And to tell you the truth, it's the first thing I think of whenever I picture what the Imperium is all about. Not the Guard and their struggles against foes far beyond them, or the Sisters and their faith, or Space Marines and whatever garbage a given chapter has going for it. It's the Navy. The cities in space with enough gold and cathedrals on them to cover an entire planet in religious iconography, coming at you in groups of 100 at once in the name of the God Emperor. With servitors plugged into the weapons, entire clans of people who are born and die on these ships to maintain them without actually knowing they're on a spaceship. Captains screaming orders and cries of faith as they open up with macro cannons the size of a palace shooting shells the size of a house. For all its flaws, the Navy is the true manifestation of the might of the Imperium of mankind. They have more ships than you, their ships are bigger than yours, and by the God Emperor, they're going to do everything they can to make sure you are utterly erased from their galaxy. And unlike every other organization within the Imperium, this one knows what it's doing. And even at its worst, even in the grimmest darkness of the far future where there is only war, where technology has degraded into the Stone Age compared to what it once was, and humanity doesn't even know how far it's fallen, you don't need a PhD in physics to ram Notre Dame straight through whatever is stupid enough to get in your way. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the barest essentials of the Imperial Navy I felt I could get away with talking about in a video. You could go far more in depth about certain doctrines, events, and battle fleets. I mean, to once again reference Battlefleet Gothic, it has a tabletop game and 2 video games devoted to it. But for the basics, there's the Imperial Navy. The long arm of the Emperor reaching across the galaxy to crush all who oppose his realm, even if sometimes it's an arm too long for its own good. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the naval slave loading the cannons to my Imperial Navy, breaking your very backs to keep things afloat. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there. For real though, I held off until the end, but by God do I hate their cannons being manually loaded by hundreds of slaves at a time. Just use a holy Christ. You can't ask me to take 40k seriously and then go, yeah, but also like they have a dozen people loading a tank-sized shell into the cannon. For real, this is the best way to do it. No, it isn't. even within the context of the Imperium degrading. The Mechanicus has a perfectly fine mastery of technology as we know it today. They would absolutely be willing to share the concept of a goddamned elevator. I cannot put into words how badly I hate this. If we were still in Rogue Trader Land, as in the first edition ever of 40k, then go nuts, please. Don't have it just be loaded by slaves, have it be loaded by slaves who then have to get into the barrel of the gun and get fired alongside the shell for holy martyr reasons or something. Don't try and tell me you want me to take you seriously with that kind of lore, though. There's Grimdark, and then there's fanfiction written by the quiet kid in school dark.